Hi, this is Pat with SolarTechDIY.com. Today we are going to talk about care and maintenance of your soldering tip, a very important concept. I've just laid out some of the soldering tips from my experience, and some of them start from way back when I was just learning and I wasn't necessarily taking the best care of my soldering tips. So we're going to take a look at one and show you a byproduct of poor care. If you look at this tip, you can see that, let me get it up against the yellow background, but you can see the divot looking wear mark right here. Now the metal has been worn very thin by oxidation. So at some point after use I failed to tin the soldering tip, and so it corroded in between use. And what happens is the soldering tip, as it heats up, it becomes weak, and before you know it, it just breaks on its own. And once it breaks, it is obviously no good because it will no longer conduct heat. It's very easy to keep your soldering tip in good condition by the tinning process, which involves first cleaning the soldering tip, which you should do about every second solar cell. It's not complicated, it doesn't take you long, but it'll save you soldering tips. Soldering tips cost about $8 depending on where you buy them from and which type. They're also reasonably hard to come by. Ace Hardware typically carries the type I need in my particular tool. Mine is very old. It's a Weller 8200-N 100/140 watts. 120 volt, 1.2 amp, so it's actually a very low amperage tool, but I inherited it from my grandfather, and to this date I've yet to find a model that works as well as this old unit. Now, to clean a soldering tip, you don't have to have something like what I'm holding in my hand. Now, I'm not forgetful, I don't need to label this so I forget, I just thought it would be clever to show you. This is a Hacko brand brass sponge solder tip cleaner. And what it is brass, basically steel wool. You depress the trigger on your soldering iron or soldering gun, and once it heats up, you simply insert it into the brass sponge, and it removes old solder and oxidation. You know, you don't have to be terribly rough with it. You're not trying to stab a buffalo. Just scrape it around, and we hold it up for inspection. Looks pretty clean. And we will then use a wet sponge and just gently wipe the surfaces with the trigger depressed. And you can wipe with the gun pushing down on the sponge, and this removes any solder, any flux, impurities, anything that might cause damage to the solder tip. I use distilled water on my sponge. This is not your average household sponge. I actually bought this from Fry's Electronics, specifically for soldering. I don't know if it has any properties a kitchen sponge wouldn't have, but I would stick with a purpose-specific sponge. To complete the process, all we do is apply just a little bit of solder all the way around. Just a nice uniform coat. And your solder tip is now protected and it's ready for use. One benefit of tinning your soldering tip is that it needs to be tinned in order to conduct heat. So when you're soldering, if you have no solder on your tip at all, you'll have great difficulty achieving a good solder. So the tinning process helps you to start off on the right foot. Your solder tip will conduct heat and you'll have a much better experience. And you won't be having to replace solder tips every other day or so. It gets expensive. Okay, thank you for tuning in, and stand by for the next topic. Until then, this is Pat with SolarTechDIY.com saying thank you for tuning in. Goodbye.